I'll be talking about the Victorian era, otherwise known as the Age of Skepticism. It is also described as the Second English Renaissance. It's one of the longest periods in the history of literature as well as world history, because Queen Victoria ruled England for one of the longest durations for any monarch, coming to about 23,226 days. That's almost roughly 63 to 64 years. She even took on the title of the Empress of India. So it was the best of times, it was the worst of times. That's how Dickens described his era. And I think that captures the essence of the era very crisply and precisely. The features of the era, the major features, when you look at the major features, there was a conflict between religion and science that was happening as a result of the publication of the book, The Origin of Species, by Charles Darwin in 1856. It caused a schism, a gap in the belief system of the generation, because till then people were comfortable thinking that God was up in the heavens, He created us and He takes care of us. But then science suddenly told them that no, it's not God, you created yourself, so God cannot help you. So there was this huge divide, this conflict between faith and fact, between religion and science, which ultimately would lead to the famous Victorian compromise. So this amount of doubt, the spirit of doubt, pessimism, and sometimes even despair is reflected in the literary works of that time as well. Another feature of the era was imperialism or colonization. The East India Company had developed a lot and established colonies across the world, and the Victorian Empire, the Victorian era was the time when British Empire was at its highest expansion and earned the epithet of the empire on which the sun never set. So that was again the high point of the expansion, the colonization of the empire as well. And there were major discoveries that were happening in science, and major theories were being advanced in social and political thinking. There was also the Industrial Revolution, which would change the way of living, the way of thinking, and the modes of communication, transport. It would change the life forever. And also the theory of utilitarianism and materialism. Public education, it was also an era of reforms, and public education would get a great boost from the side of the government and from the side of the people as well. Looking at the major figures of the era, we have Charles Darwin and his contemporaries, who are sometimes dubbed as the four bearded god killers: Charles Darwin, Friedrich Nietzsche, Karl Marx, and of course Sigmund Freud. Along with these people, we have other giants such as Benjamin Disraeli, who was a political leader, a prime minister, and also a writer. There was Michael Faraday, the famous physicist. There was Alexander Graham Bell, who with his revolutionary invention of the telephone, actually the impact, the aftermath of his invention is still being reflected in our times, in our lives. There was J.S. Mill and George Stephenson, who was known as the father of the railways. Also Florence Nightingale and Annie Besant, who would give remarkable contributions to the society. In Europe, we have Louis Pasteur and Marie Curie revolutionizing the science and the world of medicine. In America, there was Lincoln, there was Thoreau, and Harriet Beecher Stowe and Emerson. In Russia, the one and only Dostoevsky ruled the scene. So, looking at the literary features of the era, skepticism definitely shines through the fabric of the literature that was produced then. There was also the deep tone of morality that you can find, and the prose that was produced during those times was chiefly didactic in nature. There was a kind of realism, but it was not the realism that you find in the pre-Victorian era of the Romantic era. It was a kind of realism that was colored with pessimism, doubt, and despair, especially when you look at the poems of Arnold. But that doesn't mean that the gallery of Victorian literature was devoid of any other emotion except pessimism and skepticism. We have the optimism of Browning, we have the satire of Thackeray, we have the brooding quiet of Dickens, the polished melancholy of Tennyson, and of course the flamboyance of Oscar Wilde. So it was a brilliant gallery of stars that was shining through when you talk about Victorian literature. There are two movements also, prominent movements. One was of course the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, comprising 7 poets led by D.G. Rossetti, who actually was the primary cause for liberating arts from the clutches of morality and also for giving the artist more freedom. And of course, there was the aesthetic movement, which advocated the cause of art for art's sake. So all the genres, the major genres such as novels, such as drama, such as poetry, all the genres flourished, and even though the morality, the tone of morality was deeply ingrained in them. So we look at the major genres section-wise, segment-wise. First we look at the poetry. So Victorian poetry, it was post-romantic poetry, and as a result of which we find a reaction against the subjectivism, emotionalism and idealism that we find in romantic poetry. So it was about nature, but it was a kind of nurtured nature that we find. It was more about urban life, about domestic life that we find in the works of Victorian writers. So leading the wagon, of course, is Tennyson, who succeeded William Wordsworth as poet laureate in 1850. His magnum opus is, of course, In Memoriam, the elegy that he wrote when he lost his close friend Arthur Hallam, and he had published 2 collections of poems before he wrote In Memoriam, and it is said that he took 17 years to complete this work. Other famous poems, short poems of Tennyson include Marina, Ulysses, Morte d'Arthur, The Charge of the Light Brigade, Maud, and so on. Some of the famous collections that he has, publications that he has made include Enoch Arden, Idylls of the King, Akbar's Dream, etc. Now T.S. Eliot called Tennyson as the great master of metric as well as melancholia. Moving on, we now have Robert Browning. The moment we mention Browning, one genre jumps up to our mind, which is dramatic monologue. Browning was almost single-handedly responsible for redrawing the paradigms of this particular genre and giving it the immense popularity that it enjoys right now. Initially, he was hugely influenced by the poet P.B. Shelley, and he did not, in his young age, he did not find much success. But then with his publication of his Bells and Pomegranates, that collection of poems, many of his best-known lyrics attained popularity. There was also Pippa Passes and Sordello, and his work, The Ring and the Book, actually written as a long hymn to his wife. It's a brilliant example of the craft of Browning. It contains 10 verses, but all the 10 verses deal with a single murder, which happened in the history in 14th century, and 10 different points of view are presented in this collection. So that technical brilliance is what makes Robert Browning stand apart from his contemporaries. The next poet critic that we have to talk about is Matthew Arnold, who was again initially ignored by the public, and he would also kind of abandon his poetry because of his hectic schedule as an administrative officer. But later on, he would devote more time for his critical writings rather than creative writing. But his famous poems include Scholar Gypsy, The Scholar Gypsy, Rugby Chapel, elegies such as Thyrsis, and so on. And actually, Arnold is now more noted for the concepts, the contributions that he gave in critical writing. So later on, he would be appointed as a professor of poetry at the Oxford University. And there his lectures, especially on translating Homer, would be published. And again, a second lecture on last words on translating Homer was also published. He would also write on the function of criticism at the present time. But what we find is Arnold's criticism is not personal or emotional or idealistic, but rather colored with social criticism. Even though he's talking about the literary works, it is colored with social criticism. And the lines, some of the concepts that he contributed were, of course, borrowed from others. Sweetness and light, for instance, taken from Swift, and also the term Philistine. And we have the touchstone method that we attribute to Arnold in criticism. Now, the lines that he wrote in his famous poem Dover Beach, that captures the essence of the dilemma that his generation faced. The lines are like this: wandering between two worlds, one dead, the other powerless to be born. So that's how we remember Arnold as the representative poet of the Victorian era. Next poet is G.M. Hopkins, who was not very voluminous in his contribution. He didn't write many poems or anything like that, but his specific way of writing, he created a new metric, a way of writing, because while studying for theology in northern Wales, he learnt Welsh and adapted the rhythm of Welsh poetry into English poetry, which gave rise to what we call as sprung rhythm. That is a specific feature of Hopkins's poem, and Hopkins was hugely influenced by Newman, who was the reason for, or who was responsible for, the Oxford movement. We also have to talk about Elizabeth Barrett Browning, because it is a world dominated by male writers. The number of female writers, we may find that it's very less. So Elizabeth Barrett Browning, wife of Robert Browning, her earlier poems might seem a bit immature and all, but later on the poems are effused with a spirit of reform. And her most famous work is a collection of poems called Sonnets from the Portuguese. And along with these, we have D.G. Rossetti, who who was the leading figure of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood. That was an informal group of 7 poets, including Rossetti and his sister Christina Rossetti, and William Morris, his very close friend. So together they worked for the liberation of art from the suffocating clutches of morality. They said artists need more freedom. But Rossetti was essentially a painter and artist. So when you look at his works, especially the most famous work of Rossetti called Blessed Damozel, we find that the color scheme and the techniques and the eye of a painter in the poem, in the words, rather than the word skill of a poet. Next poet would be William Morris, again a member of the pre-Raphaelite Brotherhood, but he has been described as the most Homeric of English poets because of the huge canvas and the number of characters that he could present in the limited time, the framework of poetry. He would work on Icelandic sagas, for instance, and his collection called The Earthly Paradise consists of 24 stories, but which is structured in the model of the Canterbury Tales. And the last poem that I'd like to discuss here is, of course, A.C. Swinburne. He was a voluminous writer, but he's not really represented well in literary history. Now, he has been described as the inventor of harmonies. His major works were essays and studies in prose and verse. We now move on to the novels of Victorian era. Now, drawing inspiration from the pre-Victorian novelists such as Jane Austen and Walter Scott, but moving away from their idealized versions of romanticism and life and nature as such. Victorian novelists portray an idealized version of life, but they highlight the hardships and the difficulties that were thrown to them by life in general. So this is again regarded as the high point of British literature, wherein the literary output was, especially in the prose and novel area, was voluminous. And we have a balance of the moralizing tone, of seriousness, and as well as humor and pathos. When you talk about Victorian novelists, there is one name that springs to your mind, that is of course Charles Dickens, who captured the spirit of Victorian era and who practically held a mirror up to the society, up to his contemporary society, and told us both the good and the bad of the society. The drawback, if you can say, is that he doesn't give much importance to plot as such, to the narrative as such, but his characters outshine with their own brilliance. It is the characters who capture our attention, both the good characters and the bad characters. So he attacked, there was a criticism, there is criticism that can be found in his works, especially social criticism, and he attacked social evils and injustice and hypocrisy that was happening around him, especially towards minorities and neglected people like children, including children. So major works, of course, Nicholas Nickleby and Pickwick Papers. He started off his career with Pickwick Papers, but he had the ear for conversations, for the sounds, for the words, and an eye for characterization, caricaturing. That is why, perhaps that is why his characters stand out. Characterization is so brilliant compared to the techniques that he gave for plots and structuring of the works. So major works include Great Expectations, Oliver Twist, A Tale of the Two Cities, Pickwick Papers, Nicholas Nickleby, David Copperfield. He was a very prolific writer. So we have a number of works that are associated with Dickens. So next we move on to talk about two sisters in literature, especially two people who managed to break the barricade of patriarchy, the Bronte sisters, Emily Bronte and Charlotte Bronte. Now they grew up all by themselves in moorland. So there was a lot of space, huge spaces wherein these kids were practically alone. They built up their own imaginary world, imaginary castles, and they were hugely influenced by Byronic figures, especially by Byron. And the heroes that we find, or the anti-heroes that we find in their works, however limited their number of works be, these heroes are easily classified, can easily be seen as Byronic heroes. So Emily Bronte, actually just a single work that she has contributed to the world of literature, but that single work has held up her name like anything. Nothing can beat the technical brilliance or the characterization that we find, the intensity that we find in that work, namely Wuthering Heights. Charlotte Bronte was more prolific compared to Emily Bronte. She brought out 3 major works. One was Jane Eyre, which is still being replayed and reworked and adapted with all the mediums. We even have video games based on Jane Eyre. So Jane Eyre, of course, the magnum opus, the classic that was contributed by Emily Bronte, and Charlotte Bronte, and Shirley, and her last work was Villiers. Now, next major female writer, Mary Ann Evans, who would play the game along the lines of patriarchy and would use a pseudonym of a male name and would call herself George Eliot while publishing her works. She was a free thinker, and she dared to challenge many of the existing social norms in her personal lives, and some of them in her literary work as well. So she had written The Scenes of Clerical Life, which is a collection of tales, before moving on to novels. Now her major works, The Mill on the Floors, Adam Bede, Middlemarch, are all testimonies of the brilliance of her as a writer. And Middlemarch especially is preserved and was a favorite of many of the following writers, because it gives a lot of details. Like Henry James said, it was a treasure house of details. So that was the relevance of George Eliot, and D.H. Lawrence once observed that she is actually the beginning point of modernism, because with her works we have the interior life of human beings being treated with, being dealt with, being analyzed, being presented in literary work for the first time. So she can be counted as the pioneer of modernism in some senses of the term. And finally, we have Thomas Hardy, who is often described as the transition writer, as a bridge between Victorian era and the modern era, because his first work was published somewhere along when the works of Trollope was being published, and his last work was published along with The Wasteland of T.S. Eliot. So he stands as the bridge between the Victorian era and the modern era. He created a fictional world of his own and gave it a name, Wessex, after one of the kingdoms of Alfred the Great's time. So major works include Far from the Madding Crowd, Tess of the D'Urbervilles, Jude the Obscure, and of course The Mayor of Casterbridge. He also published a collection of poems called the Dinas. And moving on to the last genre, the theatre, there were a lot of farces, burlesques, and comic operas, especially by Gilbert and Sullivan. But when you talk of theatre and the drama of those times, there is only one name that comes to our mind, which is that of Oscar Wilde, who fascinated the audience, the contemporary audience, with his flamboyance and brilliant wit. So he was a poet, dramatist, and a novelist, but he comes somewhere in the late Victorian period. Major works, he was an Irish writer, and his major works include The Importance of Being Earnest, Lady Windermere's Fan, and A Woman of No Importance. His only novel, The Picture of Dorian Gray, is considered to be a classic in psychological characterization, in how the dark areas of human psyche can be explored. So that is still retained as a classic for reading. And after he was released from prison, following a number of charges and turbulences in personal life, he wrote The Ballad of Reading Gaol. And perhaps we can conclude with mentioning one last dramatist, George Bernard Shaw. He is more of a modern writer because his works go well into the 20th century, and he received a Nobel Prize in 1925. But very often we find that when you're talking about Victorian dramatists, George Bernard Shaw is also mentioned. So he was a very prolific writer. He wrote a number of dramas, and he was very vociferous in his criticism of contemporary British society. He was a critic, he was a socialist, he was a free thinker, he was a defender of women's rights, he was a very loud advocate for equality and a strict vegetarian. He was a member of the Fabian Society, and the plays for Puritans, Caesar and Cleopatra, Apple Cart, all these are famous works of Bernard Shaw. Many of his plays actually shocked the Victorian audience because they were not ready for Shaw or Shavian wit, what we call as Shavian wit. There were a number of prose writers also, and usually we mention Mrs. Gaskell and her biography of Charlotte Bronte. So it's a very huge arena of writers that we have in Victorian era. It's impossible to capture all of them, the brilliance of all of them in this short span of time. But what I've done is, I've done it in such a way so that you understand, you get an idea about what were the features, who were the major names that you have to associate with it, and what were their contributions to literature.